The day Elias Calhoun nailed a handwritten sign to the gate post of his ranch that read "No solicitors, no preachers, no matchmakers." Half of Redemption Creek, Texas laughed and the other half understood completely. It was the autumn of 1878, and Elias had buried his wife, Clara, exactly 14 months prior. 14 months of hard silence, of nights so long and cold they felt like a punishment from God himself. He had 340 acres of ranch land, a small herd of cattle that needed tending, a foreman named Pete Alvarez who smoked too much and talked too little, and two sons, Jacob, who was 11, and Thomas, who had just turned 8. He had the weight of grief on his shoulders like a saddle made of iron, and he had made up his mind the way only a man who has loved deeply and lost completely can make up his mind. He would not remarry. He swore it to the stars on a cold October night, out on the porch with a cup of cooling coffee in his hand, and he meant every word of it. Elias Calhoun was 34 years old, with sun-darkened skin and hands that bore the calluses of 2 decades of hard work. He had deep-set brown eyes the color of walnut wood, a jaw that seemed to have been carved from the same land he worked, and a stubbornness that his mother had once called his finest quality and his worst. He was not a cruel man. He was not even an unfriendly one when the situation called for it. He was simply done. Done with hoping, done with needing, and most certainly done with the idea of bringing another woman into his home to love, only to risk the unbearable again. The town of Redemption Creek sat at the edge of the hill country, 40 miles southeast of San Antonio. It had a general store, a livery, a church, a saloon called the Silver Spur, a small schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall, and a post office run by a man named Gerald Prout who knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves. The railroad hadn't reached Redemption Creek yet, though there was talk of it, the way there was always talk of things that hadn't happened. Life moved at the pace of cattle drives and seasonal rains, and most people were content with that rhythm. It was on a Monday morning in late September of 1878 that a wagon rolled into town carrying more luggage than made sense for one person, a leather-bound journal balanced on the driver's knee, and a woman who looked like she had never in her life considered the possibility that things might not go her way. Her name was Nora Calloway, and she was 28 years old, which in 1878 and in a place like Redemption Creek meant that more than a few people had already privately decided she was on the shelf. She had arrived from Memphis, Tennessee, following a series of circumstances that had left her without family, without money, and with nothing but the address of her late mother's cousin, a widow named Hattie Greer, who had written in a letter 6 months ago that there was work to be had in Redemption Creek for a woman willing to cook, clean, and manage a household. Nora had dark auburn hair, green eyes that caught the light like creek water in July, and a posture so straight that people assumed she had been educated formally, which she had been briefly, before her father's business collapsed, and life had decided education was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had a sharp tongue when she needed one and a warmth that came on slowly, like a fire catching in damp wood. She was practical, opinionated, utterly determined, and she had never in her life nailed a sign to any post, because she had never believed signs kept away the things that were meant to find you. Hattie Greer met her at the edge of town and immediately apologized. "I wrote that letter before my hip gave out on me entirely," Hattie said, gripping her cane and looking genuinely pained. "The position I had in mind is no longer available, Nora. Mrs. Patterson hired a girl from out of Bixar County last month. I am sorry, truly." Nora sat on the wagon seat and looked at the town spread out before her in the morning light. She had $32 in her purse, which was everything she had in the world. She had traveled 3 days to get here. She took a breath that was slower and deeper than the ones that had come before it. "There must be other positions," she said. "There might be," Hattie said carefully, "though Redemption Creek is a small town." "Small towns still need things done," Nora said, and climbed down from the wagon. She spent that morning visiting every establishment in town. The general store, run by a Mr. and Mrs. Bowen, did not need a hand. The Silver Spur Saloon needed a girl, but not the kind Nora intended to be. The schoolhouse had a teacher already. The livery was operated by a man who did not believe in hiring women for reasons he could not articulate clearly. Gerald Prout at the post office said he had all the help he needed, which was none, since he enjoyed doing everything himself. By afternoon, she had eaten a meal at the small eating house on the main street, spent 50 cents she could not afford, and sat with Hattie, who was looking increasingly guilty. "There is one possibility," Hattie said, turning her cup of tea in her hands. "Elias Calhoun. He's got a ranch about 2 miles east of here. Lost his wife last year. He's got 2 boys and no one to manage the house. Pete Alvarez, who works the cattle with him, said just last week that the place is in a state." "Then he needs help," Nora said. "He does," Hattie agreed. "But he also put a sign on his gate." "What kind of sign?" Hattie told her. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That sounds like a man who is hurting and doesn't know what to do about it. That sounds like a man who will send you straight back down his road before you finish your sentence," Hattie said. "We will see about that," said Nora, and she meant it. She drove the wagon out to the Calhoun ranch the next morning, which was a Tuesday. The ranch house was a solid, handsome structure built from timber and stone, 2 stories tall with a porch running the full length of the front. It would have been beautiful if someone had swept the porch in recent memory, if the window boxes had not gone empty and dry, if the general air of the place had not communicated so clearly that whoever lived here was surviving rather than living. The barn was well kept. The fence lines were sound. The cattle she could see grazing in the far pasture looked healthy. Elias Calhoun was clearly not a man who neglected his work. He had simply stopped attending to anything that wasn't work. She read the sign on the gate post. She opened the gate anyway. She had barely driven the wagon 20 yards up the path when a man came out of the barn. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a worn canvas shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the September chill. He had dark hair with a trace of silver at the temples and an expression on his face that communicated, quite efficiently, that she was not welcome. "Gate says no solicitors," he called out. "I read it," Nora called back. "And yet here you are." "And yet here I am," she agreed. She pulled the wagon to a stop and set the brake. "I am not soliciting anything, Mr. Calhoun. I am offering something." He walked toward her with the unhurried certainty of a man on his own land. He looked up at her on the wagon seat and she looked down at him, and neither of them blinked. "Miss," he said, his voice carrying the flat, deliberate patience of a man trying not to be rude, "I don't know who sent you out here, but I don't need a housekeeper, I don't need a cook, and I especially don't need whatever it is you've been told to offer me. You have 2 boys and a house that hasn't been properly cleaned since before summer," she said. "I can see the state of the porch from here. The window boxes are dead. I would wager your kitchen hasn't had a proper meal cooked in it in weeks. I am not here to marry you, Mr. Calhoun. I am here to work." Something crossed his face then quickly, like a shadow moving over open ground. She had touched a nerve. She watched him decide not to show it. "I manage fine," he said. "You manage the cattle fine," she said. "The house is a different matter." He put his hands on his hips and looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between irritated and reluctantly amused. "You are a direct woman." "I was told there was no room for anything else out here," she said. "Who told you that?" "Common sense," she said. A small silence opened up between them. From the direction of the house she could hear the sound of boys. A shout, a thump, something falling. Elias did not look toward the house, but his jaw tightened slightly. "I'm not in the market for complications," he said. "Neither am I," she said. "I need work, you need help. That seems straightforward to me." "Nothing in my experience has ever been as straightforward as it seemed," he said. "Then perhaps your experience has been unlucky," she said. "Are you going to let me down off this wagon, or are we going to keep having this conversation with me sitting up here like a figurehead?" He looked at her for another long moment. Then, with the air of a man who had already decided to regret this, he reached up and handed her down from the wagon seat. His grip was firm and brief and entirely proper, and he stepped back as soon as she was standing. 2 weeks, he said. You can try it 2 weeks. I pay fair wages for fair work. You'll have the small room off the kitchen. You eat with the family because there's no other arrangement that makes sense. You keep to your work and stay out of my business and we'll get along fine. Agreed, she said. And we are not going to be friends, he added, which she understood was the most important thing he needed to say. Understood, she said, and she picked up her traveling bag and walked toward the house. And only when her back was to him did she allow herself a small, private smile. The inside of the house told the same story the outside had suggested, only more quietly and more painfully. It was not filthy. Elias Calhoun was not the kind of man who lived in filth. But there was a heaviness to the rooms, a quality of things set down and not picked up again, of dust settling where it had not been invited. The parlor had a good sofa and 2 armchairs and a small bookcase, and on the mantelpiece there was a framed photograph of a woman with a gentle face and soft eyes, and a child's drawing tacked beside it, and a small ceramic figurine that had been moved recently. She could tell by the ring of dust around it, and placed exactly so. Those were the only things in the room that had been tended. The rest was just there, surviving without care. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, with a good cast iron stove and a solid work table and a pantry that had some staples but needed replenishing badly. Nora noted everything with the quick, cataloging mind of a woman who had been managing households since she was 16, and she rolled up her sleeves and set about making the place functional. The 2 boys found her in the kitchen 20 minutes after she arrived. Jacob came first, standing in the doorway with the wary, assessing look of a boy who had learned to be careful about new things. He was tall for 11, dark like his father with his mother's eyes, which Nora would only later understand when she looked at the photograph on the mantel again. "Papa said you're the new housekeeper," Jacob said. "That's right," Nora said, not stopping what she was doing. "We had a housekeeper before, Mrs. Dunmore. She left because Papa was difficult." "I can handle difficult," Nora said. "She said that too," Jacob told her, with the brutal honesty only children can deliver without cruelty. "What happened to Mrs. Dunmore, exactly?" Nora asked. "Papa told her she rearranged his desk and he'd rather live in a barn than have someone rearrange his desk," Jacob said. "She left the next morning." "I will not touch his desk," Nora said solemnly. Thomas appeared then, smaller and rounder-cheeked than his brother, and stood behind Jacob with his eyes enormous. He looked at Nora and Nora looked at him. "Do you cook biscuits?" Thomas asked. "I do," she said, "with honey. If there's honey, yes." "There's honey," he said, and that was apparently the end of any reservation Thomas Calhoun had about the new situation. Jacob took longer. But Nora had not expected otherwise. She cooked supper that night for the first time in the Calhoun kitchen, and it was nothing fancy because the pantry didn't allow for fancy, but it was good. Roasted chicken, biscuits, boiled potatoes seasoned with the sparse herbs she found dried and hanging by the window, and a gravy that filled the kitchen with a smell that seemed to genuinely surprise everyone who encountered it. She set the table properly, which it appeared had not been done in some time, and she called everyone to supper at the appropriate hour. Elias came in from outside, washed his hands at the basin, and sat down at the head of the table. He looked at the food. He did not say anything. He served his sons and then himself, and he ate in silence, but he ate all of it, which Nora took as the only compliment she was likely to receive that evening. "It's good," Thomas said, enthusiastically and with gravy on his chin. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "Mama used to make biscuits different," Jacob said, not cruelly, just honestly. "I know," Nora said. "I'm not trying to make them the same, just trying to make them good." Elias looked up at that. He looked at her for a brief, unguarded moment, and then he looked back at his plate. After supper she washed the dishes, settled the kitchen, checked that the boys had washed before bed, and then sat in her small room with her journal and wrote 2 pages about the day. Her hand was tired and her feet were sore, and she was more tired than she had been in some time, and she was also, she noted with quiet surprise, something close to hopeful. She woke before dawn and had coffee ready when Elias came through the kitchen on his way to the barn, and she did not make conversation, just handed him a cup and let him take it without comment. He looked at her as if he were calculating the situation for traps and finding none, and went out the door, and she heard him say something short and surprised under his breath just before the door swung shut. She spent the morning cleaning the house. Not rearranging. She had taken Jacob's warning seriously, but cleaning. Sweeping, scrubbing, washing the windows so the morning light came in properly, airing out the parlor, bringing in fresh water, tending the front porch until it was habitable again. She found a crate of Nora Calhoun's things in the corner of the parlor, neatly packed as if someone had started to put them away and then stopped. She left the crate exactly where it was. That was not her business. She planted seeds in the window boxes because the general store in town would give her credit against her wages, which Elias had agreed to in advance, and because empty window boxes are a particular kind of sad that is easy enough to fix. She chose herbs rosemary, thyme, sage, things practical and beautiful in equal measure. Pete Alvarez came to the kitchen door that afternoon looking for something cold to drink, and found himself confronted instead with a glass of cold well water, and a woman who asked him directly if he thought Elias was eating properly. Pete was a small, compact man in his 40s with a weathered face and a mustache and the cautious expression of a man who had learned that certain conversations could turn on you unexpectedly. He drank the water and thought about the question. "He eats," Pete said carefully. "That's not what I asked," Nora said. Pete looked at her. "He's doing better than he was 6 months ago," he offered. "And 6 months ago," Pete turned his hat in his hands. "About as bad as you can do and still be standing upright," he said quietly. Nora absorbed that. "I see," she said. "He's a good man," Pete said, with the firmness of someone who wanted to be understood on this point. "I believe that," she said. "I haven't seen anything to suggest otherwise." Pete looked at the kitchen around him, and at the smell of the supper she was already preparing, and something in his expression softened significantly. "Clara was a fine woman," he said. "They were well suited." "This place has missed having someone who cares about it," he finished carefully. "I care about doing my job well," Nora said. "Nothing more complicated than that right now." Pete smiled at that, small and knowing, and thanked her for the water and went back to his work. On the Wednesday of her first week, Nora walked into town to buy provisions and found herself in a conversation at the general store with a woman named Isabel Hooper, who was the wife of the town's only doctor, a man named Benjamin Hooper. Isabel was a forthright, cheerful woman with the kind of social energy that powered itself and didn't particularly need reciprocation to continue. "You're working out at the Calhoun place," Isabel said, not as a question. "I am," Nora said. "Elias Calhoun," Isabel said, with a particular tone that carried several sentences worth of information compressed into 2 words. "He seems capable," Nora said, "and determined to manage without help." "He is all of those things," Isabel agreed. "He was also, before Clara died, the kind of man who laughed easily and had opinions about absolutely everything, and once organized the entire spring fair single-handedly because he thought it could be done better. He hasn't been that man in 14 months. Nora thought about this while Mrs. Bowen weighed out flour. "Grief takes different shapes," she said. "It does," Isabel said. "His shape is a fortress." Nora had noticed that too. On Thursday, she was sweeping the porch when Jacob came and sat on the steps beside her and asked, without any introduction or context, whether she thought his mother could see them from wherever she was. Nora stopped sweeping. She sat down beside him on the step and thought about the question the way it deserved to be thought about. "I think," she said slowly, "that people who love us very much don't stop because of distance, even that kind of distance." Jacob was quiet. His hands were folded on his knees in a way that was too adult for 11. "Papa won't talk about her," he said. "He gets up and leaves the room when I try." "It's very hard for him," Nora said. "It's hard for me too," Jacob said with a kind of simple dignity that was striking. "I know," she said. "I know it is." She did not say anything else because there was nothing else that was hers to say, but she put her hand briefly on his shoulder and felt him not pull away, and that was something. On Friday, she overheard Elias tell Pete, outside the kitchen window while she was kneading bread, that the house had not smelled like anything in over a year, and now it smelled like bread and something else he couldn't name. And Pete said the something else was rosemary from the window boxes, and Elias went quiet, and Pete said, "She's good at this, Elias," and Elias said, "I know," and then nothing more was said. She had not been trying to impress him. Or rather, she had not been trying to impress him in the way he seemed to fear. She was simply doing her work, and her work had a quality to it because she took it seriously, and that was different from performing kindness for strategic purposes. She hoped he would come to understand the difference. She suspected it might take time. On Saturday, something happened that she had not planned. Thomas fell ill. Not seriously, a child's fever, the kind that burns hot and fast and worries you while it lasts and is generally gone by morning. But he was miserable, flushed and tearful, and when Nora brought a cool cloth for his forehead and sat beside his bed, he caught her hand and held on to it with the complete and trusting grip of a sick child who needs someone present. She stayed. She was still there an hour later when Elias came to check on Thomas and found her in the chair beside the bed with Thomas's small hand in hers, and a story half told to a boy who had fallen asleep in the middle of it. Elias stood in the doorway and Nora looked up at him, and there was a moment between them that was nothing like what she had expected. He did not look suspicious or calculating or withdrawn. He looked, just for a moment, entirely human. Like a man who had not allowed himself to feel anything for a very long time, and was not sure what to do with what he was currently feeling. She eased Thomas's hand down onto the blanket and rose quietly from the chair and walked past Elias in the doorway. He stepped aside to let her pass, and she was almost clear of the doorway when he said, quietly, "Thank you." She paused. She looked at him. It was the first thing he had said to her that was not a question or an instruction or a careful boundary. "He's a good boy," she said. "You should be proud of him." She kept walking before he could close himself back up again. Sunday was her one day of rest, or it was supposed to be. She went to the church in town with Hattie Greer, who was slowly forgiving herself for the situation with the lost position. The minister preached about the difficulty of beginnings and the necessity of patience, which Nora privately thought was quite applicable, though she suspected he had intended it to apply to the new irrigation project the town was attempting. After church, Isabel Hooper found her on the steps and said, "I heard Thomas was sick last night. I heard you stayed with him." "I was there," Nora said, with the careful modesty of a woman who had not done it to be heard about. "Elias told Benjamin," Isabel said. "He came to the surgery yesterday evening, which was notable because Elias Calhoun has not voluntarily said more than 12 words to another human being who wasn't Pete Alvarez or his sons in over a year. I expect he was just concerned about Thomas," Nora said. "He said the housekeeper stayed with Thomas for 2 hours and told him a story," Isabel said. "That was what he told Benjamin, word for word." Nora looked at the sky. It was the particular blue of late September in the Texas Hill Country, clear and deep and beginning to lean toward the colder colors of autumn. "He is watching me," she said, not with alarm, with a matter-of-fact awareness. "He doesn't know he is," Isabel said. "That's the interesting part." She returned to the ranch that afternoon and found Elias on the porch, a thing she had not seen him do before. He had always been at work or inside or somewhere purposeful, but he was sitting in the rocking chair with a cup of coffee, looking out at the land, and when she came up the path he did not move to go inside. She sat in the other chair because the porch was a large porch and there was room enough for 2 people to share it without complication. He said, "How was church?" "Good sermon," she said. "About patience." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, short and involuntary, and turned it into something neutral before it could become anything. "You don't go?" she asked. "Not lately," he said. "Do you intend to again?" He looked at the land. "I don't know." She did not push. She sat with her own coffee and they watched the October light settle across the pasture in a way that was genuinely beautiful, and she let the silence be comfortable because she felt it was, and gradually she believed he felt it too. "Thomas is recovered," he said after a while. "I could tell this morning," she said. "He asked for extra biscuits." "That's a reliable indicator," he agreed. Another silence, a good silence. "You handled it well," he said, "the fever staying." "It was the right thing to do," she said simply. He looked at her then, and she met his eyes without deflecting, and there was something there between them that neither of them moved toward and neither of them moved away from. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone easier to dismiss," he said honestly. "I hope that's a compliment," she said. "I haven't decided yet," he said, and there it was again, that involuntary quality of the thing that wanted to be a laugh. She went inside to start supper, and she was smiling, quietly and for no one but herself. The second week began with a different quality than the first. The house was clean and running. The boys were accustomed to her. Pete had taken to stopping at the kitchen door for conversation with increasing frequency, and the window boxes had begun to show the first pale green of new growth. The rhythm of the ranch had absorbed her the way a river absorbs a tributary, adjusting its current slightly without making a point of it. Elias was at the breakfast table on Monday when she came in, and he said good morning, which he had not said before. She said good morning in return and put coffee in front of him, and did not make it significant, because the moment you make something like that significant with a man who is operating on pure defensiveness, you lose whatever ground you have gained. She had brought her small collection of books from her traveling bag and placed them on the kitchen shelf. Practical books, mostly. A herbal remedy guide, a book on household management, a volume of poetry that had been her mother's, and a battered copy of a novel she had read 4 times. Jacob noticed the books and asked about them, and she invited him to read whichever he liked, and he took the novel and was absorbed in it by that afternoon in a way that seemed to genuinely surprise his father. "He wasn't reading much," Elias said to her, with a directness that was becoming a quality she associated with him. "He's reading now," she said. "What's the book?" "Washington Irving," she said. "Tales. Boys his age tend to find it engaging." Elias looked at her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, the one where he was assessing something and not yet willing to give his assessment out loud. "You are educated," he said. "Somewhat," she said. "More self-made than formally trained, if I'm honest. How does a woman who reads Washington Irving and grows herbs in window boxes and stays up 2 hours with a sick child she's known for a week end up as a ranch housekeeper in Redemption Creek, Texas?" he asked. It was the most personal thing he had said to her. She understood it had cost him something. "My father's business failed when I was 23, she said, keeping it factual and clean. "He died 2 years later. My mother was already gone. I had no other family in Memphis except a name in a letter my mother had kept, and that name turned out to be my only real option. Hattie Greer," he said. "Whose position turned out not to exist," she said. "So here I am." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said, "about your parents." "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. Neither of them had expected that exchange. There was a pause that was different from the earlier silences, heavier with the weight of the things that had been named. "Clara was," he began and stopped. "You don't have to," she said. "No," he said. "I think maybe I should." He looked at the kitchen table, at the grain of the wood. "She was good. Not perfectly easy, nobody is, but genuinely good. She made this place feel like a home. After she went, it stopped feeling like anything." "I didn't know a house could just stop feeling like a place." Nora listened without rushing toward any response. That was something she had learned was rare enough to be valuable. "The boys needed someone to keep things running," he continued. "I tried. I'm not domestic. I can keep cattle alive and fence lines sound, but I cannot make a house feel inhabited. I brought in Mrs. Dunmore." "The desk situation," Nora said. "I overreacted," he said, and there was in that admission something that seemed to cost him considerably. "She wasn't trying to harm anything. I was angry at everything that year and she happened to be in reach of it. You know that now, she said. I knew it the day after she left, he said. That didn't help Mrs. Dunmore. No, Nora agreed. But knowing it now still matters. He looked up at her and she was struck again by those walnut-dark eyes and the intelligence in them and the exhaustion that lived behind the intelligence, the exhaustion of a man who had been keeping himself together by pure will for more than a year. You're not afraid of me, he said. It seemed to both puzzle and relieve him. Should I be? Mrs. Dunmore thought so. Mrs. Dunmore doesn't sound like she was particularly suited for difficult terrain, Nora said, and he gave her a look and then, finally, actually laughed. It was short and rusty, like a gate that hadn't been opened in a season, but it was a real laugh, and it transformed his face entirely for the 2 seconds it lasted. No, he said. She was not. She let the moment settle and then returned to her work, and Elias Calhoun sat at the kitchen table for another 10 minutes drinking his coffee before he went out to the barn, and Nora thought that 10 extra minutes was a good sign, and kept that thought to herself. On Tuesday of the second week, exactly 1 week after she had arrived, 2 things happened that moved the situation considerably further along than anyone had anticipated. The first was that a man came to the ranch on horseback, a man named Roland Steele, who was the owner of a neighboring parcel and who had been locked in a dispute with Elias over a water rights issue relating to the creek that crossed both properties. Roland Steele was 40 years old, heavyset, and had the particular confidence of a man who believed that the size of his property determined the correctness of his position. He rode up to the gate without reading the sign or disregarding it. He clearly already knew about it and came to the porch and knocked. Nora answered, because Elias was at the far pasture and she had heard the knock. I need Calhoun, Steele said, not unpleasantly but with the casual disregard for the person standing in front of him that some men deploy automatically. He's in the pasture, she said. I can take him a message. It's not a message matter, Steele said. It concerns the creek access. He's got his men maintaining a channel that redirects water off the lower section of his land, which is drying out the access I have on my eastern boundary. We've been over this twice. I need it settled. I see, Nora said. And what resolution are you proposing? Steele looked at her properly for the first time, reassessing. I'm proposing he shifts his channel back 300 yards north, which would redirect the water impact to his lower pasture, Nora said. She had walked that pasture on Sunday with Thomas, who liked to look at things. She had a good picture of the land. That pasture is where he keeps his cattle through the wet months. Steele blinked. You know the layout of his land. I observe things, she said. I'm not suggesting you're wrong about your water access. I'm suggesting the proposed solution creates an equal problem for him. There may be a different arrangement. Mr. Calhoun is the person to discuss that with, of course, but I'd suggest you come prepared with more than one option. There was a long pause in which Roland Steele appeared to entirely reevaluate the conversation he had expected to have. I'll come back when Calhoun's available, he said, more carefully than he had spoken before. I'll let him know you came, she said, and waited until Steele had turned his horse and ridden back down the path before she went inside. When Elias returned at midday and she told him Roland Steele had come, and what Steele had said, and what she had said in response, he went very still. You told him his solution would flood my lower pasture, he said. I mentioned it would redirect the water impact there, yes, she said. How do you know the layout of my land well enough for that? I walked it Sunday, she said, with Thomas. He looked at her. She could not quite read what was happening in his expression because it was doing too many things at once. The water dispute with Steele has been ongoing since spring, he said finally. I gathered, she said. He seemed surprised to have to think about it from a different angle. He is not a man who thinks from different angles, Elias said. He tends to come at things straight until they break, or he does. That approach has limitations, Nora said. It does, Elias agreed, and she saw the corner of his mouth move in the way that preceded a suppressed smile. You know he'll come back. I expect so, but perhaps with more than one option this time. He shook his head slowly, not in exasperation but in something that looked almost like wonder. "You have been on this ranch for 8 days," he said. "I work quickly," she said. The second thing that happened on that Tuesday was at the supper table at the end of the evening, after the boys had been sent to wash up and the kitchen was clean and Nora was about to go to her room. Elias was at the table with his coffee and he said, with a careful, deliberate quality that told her he had been preparing this, "Your 2 weeks are not up yet." "No," she said, "4 more days." "I want to extend the arrangement," he said, "permanently, if that suits you." She looked at him. "Are you offering me a permanent position?" "I am," he said. "The wage would increase by $1 a week." And he paused. "The room is too small. There's a larger room upstairs at the end of the hall. It was Clara's sewing room. I'd cleared it already. You should have proper quarters." She understood that offering Clara's sewing room was a significant thing, in the way that only a woman who had been paying careful attention for 8 days could understand. "Thank you," she said. "I accept." He nodded and looked at his coffee, and she said good night and went to her small room, and in the dark she lay awake for a while, understanding that something had shifted between them. Not dramatically, not in any way that either of them would have named as romantic, not yet, but shifted nonetheless, like land settling after the first rain. She moved into the larger room the next morning. It had a window that faced east and caught the sunrise, and space for a proper bureau, and a quiet quality that felt lived in with enough distance. She arranged her few things in it and set her books on the small shelf and placed her mother's hairbrush on the bureau and opened the window to let in the morning air, which carried the smell of cooling grass and cattle and the faint, clean smell of the nearby creek. She was standing at the window when she heard the boys below in the yard, Jacob explaining something complex and earnest to Thomas, who was mostly interested in a beetle he had found. She heard Elias come out of the barn and speak to Pete, 2 sentences in the low, easy shorthand of men who have worked together long enough not to need complete sentences. She heard the creak of the gate as the first cool breeze of the day moved through it. It felt, she thought, like a place. The following week settled into a rhythm that was its own kind of grace. October deepened into the hill country with the particular colors it brought, the live oaks going bronze and amber at the edges, the evenings arriving earlier and colder, the stars appearing sooner and in greater numbers. The ranch operated smoothly. Elias and Pete managed the cattle with the quiet efficiency of long practice. Jacob read everything Nora could find for him and began, tentatively, to ask her questions about history and geography that she was genuinely delighted to engage with. Thomas decided at some point that Nora was his personal source of biscuits and stories, a position he defended with the absolute certainty of a confident 8-year-old. And Elias came to supper every night and stayed at the table afterward more and more often. It happened gradually, the way most true things happen. He would stay for a second cup of coffee after the boys had gone up. She would be at the table with her journal or mending or sometimes simply her own cup of tea. And they would talk. Carefully at first, and then with increasing directness, and then sometimes with the kind of ease that surprises you when you notice it, the way you sometimes notice you've been warm for a while without having identified the source. He told her about buying the ranch land 8 years ago with money saved from 6 years of cattle driving, about building the house with Pete's help and 3 other men from town, about meeting Clara at a church social in San Antonio, and knowing within a week that she was the most important person he had ever met. He told her about the years of the ranch growing, the years of the boys growing, the years that had been genuinely and completely happy, and she listened to all of it without trying to rush him through it or arrive at the part that would be comfortable for her. She told him about Memphis, about the household she had managed for her parents from age 16, about the books she had read and the things she had taught herself, about the grief of losing both parents in 2 years and the strange practical necessity of rebuilding a life from nothing. She was honest about the hardship without performing it for sympathy, and he understood that, which she had begun to believe he would. One evening in late October, she was reading at the table when he came in from outside unexpectedly, which was unusual, and he sat down across from her and said, "There was a time I thought I might die of it." She did not ask what it was. She waited. "The first 3 months after Clara," he said. "I don't mean that dramatically. I mean I genuinely did not understand how a person was supposed to continue. The boys kept me moving. I got up every morning because there was no version of myself that could justify not getting up when they needed getting up, but I did not understand it. And now," she asked. He considered. "Now I understand it is possible to continue," he said. "I'm not sure I had arrived at understanding that it was worthwhile continuing." He looked across the table at her when he said this last part, and the look was not anything she could describe simply. It was too layered for simple description. It was the look of a man who was beginning, cautiously and against his considerable better judgment, to notice that she was there. "I think it might be," she said. "Worthwhile." "You think it might be?" he repeated. "I think," she said carefully, "that there is more to come for this ranch, for your boys, for you. I think the fact that you're still here, and you're still running this land well, and your sons are healthy and growing, and Jacob is reading Washington Irving and actually enjoying it, I think that suggests something about you that you should probably consider." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are a remarkable woman," he said, quietly and plainly, as a statement of fact rather than a compliment. She felt the warmth of it in a way that startled her, because she had not been expecting it and had not been seeking it. "You don't need to say that," she said. "I know I don't," he said. "That's why I said it." After that evening, something new was present between them that had not been present before. Not declared, not named, but present in the way heat is present in a room after the fire has been laid, warm and specific and impossible to mistake. It changed small things. He would look for her when he came in, not prominently, but she noticed it. He began offering opinions when she was cooking, not criticisms, just small passing preferences. "Clara used to add sage to that. I always liked it." And she would add sage, not because she felt she had to, but because it was a piece of information freely offered, and she valued pieces of information freely offered. He started reading after supper sometimes, at the other end of the table, a habit she suspected he had abandoned along with everything else. And the quiet of two people reading in the same room at the end of the day is one of the most civilized and companionable things there is. Jacob, who was 11 and therefore acutely perceptive in the way of children who have had to pay careful attention to adult behavior, said to Nora one morning while she was pinning laundry, "Papa laughed at supper last night." "He did," Nora agreed. "He hasn't done that in a long time," Jacob said. "Things can change," Nora said carefully. "Are you going to stay?" Jacob asked. Nora looked at him. "That is not entirely my decision," she said honestly. "It should be partly your decision," Jacob said, with the direct fairness of a boy raised by people of good character. "It is partly," she said. "And as far as my part goes, yes, I'm planning to stay." Jacob absorbed this. "Good," he said, with the finality of someone who had decided that was the acceptable answer, and went back to his book. In November, Roland Steele returned, as Nora had expected he would, with more than one option. He and Elias met on the porch and discussed the water rights for an hour, and arrived at an arrangement that involved a shared channel with specified access periods on each side, which was a perfectly sensible solution that had apparently not been reachable before because neither man had been looking at it from any angle other than his own. Steele, when he left, tipped his hat toward the kitchen window where Nora was visible, which Elias noticed. "He's thanking you," Elias said, coming inside. "He's acknowledging that the conversation last month may have helped," she said. "You redirected an argument that has been going on for 6 months in one afternoon conversation," he said. "I only mentioned the obvious," she said. "Nora," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name and they both noticed it. "Take the credit." She looked at him. He was standing just inside the kitchen doorway, his hat in his hand, and the afternoon light came through the window and fell across him in a way that she had been noticing more frequently and more helplessly for several weeks. "All right," she said. "I'll take the credit." He smiled. Properly and fully this time, not the small suppressed half-smile she had been seeing, but an actual smile that reached his eyes and changed his whole face. And she thought, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable, that she was in real and significant trouble, and had been for some time. She turned back to the stove before her face could communicate this. He went to wash up before supper, and she stood at the stove and admitted to herself, quietly and seriously, that what she felt for this man was not simple, not practical, not anything that fit neatly into the category of doing her job and staying out of his business, and that she was going to need to think very carefully about what to do with that. What she decided, with the practical common sense that had always been her most reliable instrument, was nothing. She would do nothing. She would continue doing her work and being kind to his sons, and having supper-table conversations and planting things in the window boxes, and she would allow whatever was happening between them to develop at its own pace, which she suspected was faster than either of them was saying out loud. She was right about that. On a Saturday in mid-November, the first real cold snap hit the hill country. The temperature dropped overnight, and by morning there was a frost across the pasture that made the world look like it had been drawn in silver. Nora built up the kitchen fire and put on oatmeal, and the kitchen was warm and smelled like cinnamon, when the boys came downstairs in their nightshirts marveling at the frost. Elias came in shortly after, having already been to the barn to check the animals, and he stood at the kitchen doorway for a moment looking at the scene. His two sons at the table arguing about who had seen the frost first, the warm kitchen, the smell of cinnamon and fire, Nora moving between the stove and the table with the easy competence of someone completely at home in a space. And his face did something complicated and quiet that she saw in her peripheral vision and pretended not to see. He sat down. He ate breakfast. He stayed longer than usual, listening to Thomas describe the frost in terms of elaborate, imaginative specifics, as if the frost were a character in a story Thomas was inventing as he went. "It came from the north," Thomas announced. "From the big cold that lives above the mountains. It breathed on everything while we were sleeping." "That's one theory," Elias said. "Do you have a better one?" Thomas asked. "Temperature differential and atmospheric conditions," Elias said. Thomas looked at him. "The cold thing is better," Thomas said. "It might be," Elias agreed. Nora looked at the two of them across the table and felt the warmth of the moment in a way that was almost painful, because it was the warmth of something she had not expected to want, and was now discovering she wanted very much. She looked away before Elias could catch her looking. He caught her looking. She knew because he said nothing. And then after a moment he cleared his throat and said he had work in the barn, which was his usual retreat, but he lingered in the doorway a moment after he'd said it, which was new. "The cold will hold through the week," she said. "I thought I might make soup this afternoon, if that sounds reasonable." "It sounds very reasonable," he said, and his voice had a quality to it that was different from the carefully managed tone she had been hearing for weeks. Something in it was less managed. "Good," she said, and turned back to the stove. He went to the barn. She put her hands flat on the work table and took a breath and told herself firmly to focus on the soup. 2 days later it rained. A serious, determined rain that kept everyone inside and filled the afternoon with the particular restlessness of people confined to close quarters by weather. Pete spent the afternoon playing cards with Jacob in the bunkhouse. Thomas fell asleep on the parlor sofa with a blanket and a book open on his chest. Nora sat in the parlor mending, and Elias came in from the barn in the early afternoon with rain on his coat and sat in the armchair across from her with a book he had picked up from the shelf. It was her copy of poetry, her mother's book. He held it without opening it for a moment, looking at the cover. "May I?" he asked. "Of course," she said. He opened it, found a page, and read in silence. She watched him covertly over her mending, watched his face as he read, the small movements of expression, the slight furrow and release of his brow. After a while he said, without looking up, "Your mother's?" "Yes," she said. "I can tell," he said. The pages are handled in a particular way. Some pages more worn than others. She looked up at that. Which pages? She asked. He turned the book and showed her. The worn pages were a handful of poems she had not consciously realized she returned to most often, but she recognized them immediately. Those are hers, she said, meaning her mother's favorites. And these, he asked, showing her different pages, ones she had turned to herself. She looked at them. Mine, she said. He looked at her. The rain made sound against the window, steady and present. Whitman, he said, indicating the poem she had chosen. He has a directness I appreciate, she said. I know the feeling, he said, and the way he said it, looking at her, made her heart do something that was inconvenient and entirely out of her control. Elias, she said. Nora, he said. They were both quiet for a moment, the rain doing all the talking. I want to say something, he said, and I want to say it correctly, and I am not sure I have the right words. Take your time, she said, though her heart was not taking its time at all. He set the book down carefully on the side table and put his hands together and looked at them. I have spent 14 months, he said, being entirely certain that the best thing I could do was feel nothing, want nothing, need nothing. I told Pete. Told myself. I nailed it to a gate post, he said, and he almost smiled, in case anyone missed the point. I noticed the sign, she said. You ignored it, he said. I thought it needed ignoring, she said. He looked up at her. It did, he said quietly. I was wrong about a great many things, about what it means to honor someone you loved. I thought it meant closing off. I thought it meant making sure nothing else could reach you, but Clara was not a woman who would have wanted that. I know that. I've always known that, I just wasn't ready to know it. Nora set down her mending. I am not asking you to forget her, she said. I know, he said. She was the first chapter of this story, she said. That does not unwrite itself, it should not. No, he agreed. He looked at her with an expression that was entirely, helplessly open in a way she had not yet seen on his face. What I want to say is that you came here 8 weeks ago and opened the gate, and nothing has been the same since, and I find I do not want it to be the same. I find that he stopped, choosing carefully, look forward to every part of the day that contains you in it. She took a breath that was not entirely steady. That is very well said, she managed. I have also noticed, he continued, with the air of a man who has decided if he is going to say something he will say all of it, that you are kind and intelligent and unreasonably capable, and that when you laughed at something Thomas said last week, it was the most genuinely good sound I have heard in over a year, and that you walked my land and understood its layout in a single afternoon, and that you read Whitman, and that you planted rosemary in the window boxes. The rosemary is for cooking, she said, and her voice was doing something small and revealing. I know why you planted it, he said. I appreciate that too. Elias, she said, if you are leading somewhere specific with this, I would appreciate you arriving. He looked at her with those dark eyes that she had been trying with decreasing success to think about practically. I think I am, he said, leading somewhere specific. He rose from the armchair and crossed the few feet of parlor floor between them, and he sat on the sofa beside her. Not inappropriately close, but close enough that she could see the exact texture of the worn canvas of his shirt, and the rain still visible in his hair. I am 34 years old, he said, and I nailed a sign to a post swearing I would never remarry, and I meant it when I wrote it, and I am sitting here on a rainy November afternoon telling you that I believe I was a considerable fool. You were grieving, she said. Yes, he said, but I am also hopeful. He said the word carefully as if feeling its weight. For the first time in over a year, and that is entirely because of you. She looked at him. She did not look away. I am not a woman who requires careful management, she said. I want to be very clear about that. I noticed that in the first 5 minutes, he said. And I am not going to pretend I have not been thinking about this conversation, she said, because I have, for several weeks. Have you? He said, and it was not quite a question. Quite consistently, she said. He reached out and took her hand, which was right there on the seat between them, and held it the way you hold something you intend to keep. She looked at their hands, her work-roughened fingers, his calloused ones, side by side. I would like to court you properly, he said, if you'll allow it. I rode out to your ranch on a Tuesday and ignored your sign, she said. I think you can assume I'll allow quite a lot. And he laughed then, the full laugh, without pulling it back, and it filled the parlor and mixed with the sound of the rain on the windows, and she laughed too, and Thomas shifted on the sofa and muttered something in his sleep and settled again. And outside the rain continued to fall on the Calhoun ranch, and everything was entirely different from what it had been before. He courted her the way a man courts when he is serious, which is to say, steadily and with intention and without theatrics. He rode with her on Sunday afternoons, showing her the far corners of the ranch land, the creek crossing, the stand of post oaks on the northern boundary, the high ridge from which you could see for 20 miles when the air was clear. He brought her things he thought she would appreciate, a new book from a stock of used volumes that came through the general store, a small piece of rose quartz he found near the creek that caught the light unusually, once a small jar of the best honey from a farm 2 miles south, because she had mentioned once briefly that she found honey useful for everything. She cooked for him the things she knew he liked. There were preferences she had catalogued now, small and specific, and they sat up later than was necessary over coffee and conversation, and Jacob started calling her Miss Nora instead of Miss Calloway, which was something nobody had agreed on but everyone had noticed. He kissed her for the first time on a December evening on the porch, which was cold enough that she could see her breath. But the cold was the specific pleasant cold of a clear winter night, and the stars were enormous, and she had said something that made him laugh, and then they were looking at each other in the starlight. And it was quite simply the natural conclusion of everything that had been building since the day she drove a wagon through a gate with a sign she had no intention of respecting. It was not a brief kiss or an uncertain one. He kissed her the way a man who has spent years knowing what he wants kisses someone he has decided is what he wants. When he pulled back, he said, I have not done anything this much on purpose in quite some time. I hope that means you intend to do it again, she said. I intend to do quite a lot of things again, he said, and kissed her again, which settled the question. She told Hattie on Christmas morning when she rode into town to deliver the gift she had made her, a carefully knitted shawl in the cream-colored wool that Hattie had always preferred. Hattie received the news with the expression of a woman who has been expecting it and is nonetheless delighted to be right. How long? Hattie asked. I believe it started around the time Thomas held my hand during the fever, Nora said. That would be the second week, Hattie said. The second week, Nora confirmed. He swore he would never remarry, Hattie said, not accusingly, just noting the distance traveled. He was wrong about that, Nora said. He knows it now. Apparently Tuesday did the trick, Hattie said, and laughed, and Nora laughed with her. He proposed to her in January, on a Sunday afternoon at the kitchen table, which was not the most romantic location, but was entirely consistent with who Elias Calhoun was, which was a man who expressed himself best in the places where he lived his real life. He had been working up to it for 3 weeks, which she knew because she could read him now with the ease of practice, and she had simply waited, knowing it would come. He said, I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it correctly, and what I want you to know before I ask it is that I am not asking out of practicality or convenience or because the boys need a mother, though they do love you and that is not nothing. I know, she said. I'm asking because I love you, he said, simply and plainly and entirely without artifice. I love who you are and how you think and the fact that you walked through that gate, and I want you to be my wife if you will have me, and I want us to have years together on this land, and I want you to plant things in every window box on this property, and tell Thomas stories when he needs them and argue with me when I'm wrong, which you do very effectively, and I want this to be your home. She had thought she would be steady when this moment came. She was not entirely. Yes, she said, and her voice was not quite what it normally was. Yes, Elias, that is exactly what I want. He reached across the table and cupped her face in his calloused hands and looked at her with an expression of such naked gladness that it undid her completely for a moment. And then he kissed her, and she kissed him back and outside in the yard. Thomas was shouting at Jacob about something to do with a dog that had wandered in from the road, and neither of them moved for a long while. They married in March of 1879, on a Saturday when the hill country was beginning to come alive again with the first warmth, the live oaks budding, the creek running full with winter melt. The ceremony was at the church in Redemption Creek, and nearly the whole town came, because Redemption Creek was the kind of town that turned out for things that mattered, and this, it was generally agreed, mattered considerably. Minister Walsh performed the ceremony with a warmth that suggested he had been waiting for this particular wedding since approximately October. Isabel Hooper cried and did not pretend she hadn't. Pete Alvarez wore his best shirt and stood straight and looked at Elias with the expression of a man who has watched a friend come back from a place he was afraid might be permanent. Jacob stood beside his father at the altar with the composure of a boy who had known for some time that this was right and was glad to see it made official. Thomas, given responsibility for the rings, discharged this duty with a level of seriousness that impressed everyone, and then immediately, upon completion, began making faces at a cat that had wandered into the back of the church, which impressed no one but was entirely Thomas. When Minister Walsh said, "You may kiss your bride," Elias turned to Nora and she turned to him, and she saw in his face the full weight of everything, the grief and the stubbornness, and the long months of hard silence, and the morning she had driven through his gate, and the evening on the rainy November porch, and all the suppers and conversations, and the moment he had said, "I love you," at a kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, all of it present in his face, and what was also present was joy. Plain and warm and genuinely his. He kissed her and the church clapped and Thomas forgot the cat. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, because the ranch was where it belonged. Nora and Isabel and Hattie had spent 2 days preparing, and Pete and the 2 ranch hands Elias employed seasonally had set up tables in the yard. And it was everything that a spring celebration in 1879 Texas hill country should be: food in abundance, neighbors talking over each other in the good way, fiddle music from a man named Clarence who played with his eyes closed, children running through the yard under the softening March sky. Elias found her at the edge of the yard at one point in the afternoon, standing a moment apart from the general celebration, looking out at the pasture in the way she sometimes did when she was taking stock of things. "Regrets?" he asked. She turned and looked at him, and her expression was almost amused. "Ask me something harder," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and they stood for a moment watching the land and the celebration together. "I nailed that sign to the gate post in October," he said. "I know," she said. "And you drove past it in September," he said. "1 year ago." "I drove past it in September," she agreed. "And Tuesday," he said. "And Tuesday," she said, and smiled up at him. "You never stood a chance." "No," he said, with a contentment so complete it was visible. "I did not." He kissed her temple, and she closed her eyes for a moment and let herself simply be in the life she had arrived at, the one she had not planned, but that fit as well as anything she had ever known. Life at the ranch in the year following their marriage settled into something that was its own particular and satisfying form. Nora was not merely a housekeeper anymore, and everyone understood that. She was the ranch's second voice, the person who managed the household accounts with the precision that had always been her particular gift, who negotiated with the general store and kept an eye on the seasonal labor costs, and noticed when the east fence line was developing problems 3 weeks before Elias or Pete did, because she had walked that fence line with Thomas on one of their Sunday exploring walks and had noted the rot in 2 posts and mentioned it at supper. Elias had looked at her across the table when she said this, with the expression that was becoming familiar, the one where he was recalibrating something. "You checked the fence line," he said. "Thomas was interested in the birds in that section," she said. "I was simply observant." "You are relentlessly observant," he said, not complainingly. "It is one of my better qualities," she said, and he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The boys flourished. Jacob, at 12, had developed a genuine appetite for learning that Nora fed with everything she could find, and she had written a letter to a bookseller in San Antonio, requesting a specific series of historical volumes that arrived in May and made Jacob go entirely silent for a week, which was how he showed the deepest appreciation. She spoke to Elias about Jacob's future, about the possibility of a proper school, and Elias listened with the seriousness it deserved, and they decided that when Jacob was 14 they would discuss the school in San Antonio seriously. Thomas, at 9, was still Thomas. He had taken to following Pete around the ranch with the determination of a boy who has decided where his heart lives, and Pete, who had no children, found this arrangement entirely to his satisfaction and taught Thomas things about cattle and horses, and the land with a patience that Nora found genuinely moving. Thomas could name every horse on the property by personality trait by June, and by August could assist in basic cattle sorting, which he described to Nora at supper with the elaborate confidence of someone who has discovered a calling. "I think he'll be a rancher," Nora said to Elias one evening. "I know he will be," Elias said. "He already is one in his mind. The body just has to catch up." They had moments of difficulty too, because life has those. There was a drought scare in June that pulled Elias into the specific anxiety of a man whose livelihood depends on rain, and she watched him during those weeks with the attention of someone who has learned the particular shape of another person's worry. She did not offer empty reassurance. She helped him plan water conservation, herd management, contingency. She sat with him in the evenings when the worry was heaviest and let him think out loud, which was what he needed, and she contributed practically when she had something to contribute, and she let the silences be something shared rather than something lonely. The rain came in July, good soaking rain, and Elias stood on the porch watching it come in from the west, and she stood beside him, and he put his arm around her without looking away from the rain, and she felt the tension in his shoulders release the way she imagined a fence releases when the pressure on it finally eases. "You were good company through that," he said. "I intend to be good company for a considerable time," she said. "I intend to hold you to it," he said. In the late summer of 1879, Nora understood that something had changed in her own body with the specific, unmistakable certainty of a woman who has been paying close attention. She confirmed it with Isabel Hooper's help in August, and Isabel embraced her with the warmth of someone who has been hoping for this for months. She told Elias that evening after supper, after the boys had gone up. She had thought about how to say it and had decided the straightforward approach was always the correct one with this man. "I believe we are expecting a child," she said. He was very still for a moment. He looked at her across the table with the kind of attention that precedes a large emotion. "When?" he managed. "March, I think," she said, "near the anniversary of our wedding, which I find satisfying." He rose from the table and came around to her side and took her face in his hands, which she had learned was his instinctive response to the things that moved him most, and he looked at her with an expression that was so full of everything she had to look away for a second to recover herself. "Nora," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you?" "I am very well," she said. "I am excellent. I feel entirely capable." "You feel entirely capable of everything at all times," he said, with a tenderness that turned it into something other than a criticism. "True," she said. He kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then her mouth, and she held on to his arms, and outside the late summer night sat warm and full around the ranch. He told the boys the next morning at breakfast, with the decisive manner of a man who does not believe in delay. Jacob received the news with the serious consideration he gave all significant information, thought about it for a moment, and said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We won't know until March," Elias said. "I want a brother," Thomas said, immediately and without ambivalence. "You don't have a say in it," Jacob told him. "I'm expressing a preference," Thomas said. "I'll pass it along." Nora said gravely, and Elias caught her eye across the table, and they shared the particular private amusement of parents, which was a new sensation and an entirely good one. The ranch continued to grow through the fall and into the winter. Elias purchased an additional 40 acres on the southern boundary, land that extended toward the creek in a way that resolved the water rights situation with Roland Steel permanently and improved the ranch's capacity for the spring season. He did so partly because the land was a good investment, and partly because he had Nora's counsel on the matter, and she had said, reviewing the figures with the unflinching practicality that was among the things he loved most about her. Buy it. The creek access alone is worth twice what they're asking. He bought it. Steele came by to acknowledge the sale, which he did with the slightly defeated good grace of a man who respects a sound business decision even when it's not his own. He shook Elias' hand and tipped his hat to Nora, who offered him coffee and conversation, and by the time he left he had agreed to a shared arrangement on the southern grazing that benefited both properties in the spring. "You could have been a merchant," Elias said, watching Steele ride away. "I could have been a number of things," she said. "I am currently a rancher's wife, which suits me considerably well." "Considerably," he said. "Exceptionally," she said, and he smiled, the full, easy smile that she had the deep satisfaction of having helped put back into his face. The baby arrived in early March of 1880, right on schedule, because by this point Nora believed she had earned the right to have things go roughly as planned. It was a boy. Thomas was triumphant. Jacob was dignified in his pleasure. Pete Alvarez, upon being informed, removed his hat and held it to his chest and looked at the ground for a moment in a way that communicated everything without saying anything. He was a healthy, substantial, loud baby boy with his father's dark hair and the green eyes that belonged to a woman from Memphis who had driven a wagon through a gate she had no business driving through, and who had never once regretted the choice. They named him Samuel. Samuel Elias Calhoun, for Elias' father, who had died before Elias bought the ranch but who had been, by Elias' account, a man of extraordinary steadiness, and Nora thought that was a fine thing to give a son. Elias sat with Samuel in the rocking chair on the porch on the second evening of his son's life, in the early spring darkness, and Nora stood in the doorway wrapped in a blanket and watched the two of them. The man who had nailed a sign to a gate post and sworn himself closed had his eyes on his new son's face with an expression of complete, undivided love that she knew had been there all along, waiting under the grief and the stubbornness and the long months of hard silence, waiting to be called back out. She had called it out. She had done it by refusing the sign and opening the gate and making herself impossible to dismiss, and by staying with Thomas through a fever and growing rosemary in window boxes and reading Whitman and arguing with him when he was wrong and being exactly herself, precisely and without apology, until he remembered what it felt like to be entirely alive. "He is perfect," Elias said softly without looking up. "He is," she agreed. "Come here," he said. She came and sat on the porch rail beside the rocking chair, and he looked up at her, and she looked down at him, and between them was every Tuesday and Sunday and rainy November afternoon and December evening on a cold porch looking at stars, and all the suppers and conversations and the moment on the parlor sofa when he had taken her hand. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he did everything, without excess and without hesitation, entirely and exactly. "I love you," she said. Samuel made a small sound in his sleep, and the ranch breathed around them in the warm spring dark. 340 acres of land that had stopped feeling like anything and had learned, over the course of one particular Tuesday and the 12 months that followed it, to feel like the truest thing in the world. The spring was magnificent that year. The rains had been generous over the winter, and the land came to life with the extravagance of a place that has had enough water and enough warmth, and knows exactly what to do with both. The pastures went deep green, the creek ran clear and full, the live oaks along the northern boundary threw new growth in every direction, and the window boxes on the porch of the Calhoun Ranch held rosemary and thyme, and a small patch of wildflowers that Nora had added because she felt, by now, entirely entitled to plant anything she wanted, and Elias had said so explicitly on 2 separate occasions. The cattle prospered. Pete managed the spring roundup with the quiet authority he always brought to it, and Jacob, now 12 and coming into a height that surprised everyone including himself, helped in ways that were genuinely useful, which Pete acknowledged with the highest compliment he was capable of delivering. He stopped explaining things to Jacob and simply asked him to do them. Thomas turned 10 in April and received from Nora a proper journal of his own, and a new pocket knife from Elias, and a cake with honey frosting, which he specified was required and non-negotiable. He spent his birthday riding with Pete over the new southern acreage, and came home sunburned and pleased and certain that ranching was the life, which nobody had doubted. In the summer, Isabel Hooper organized a social at the schoolhouse to celebrate the town's 25th year, and Nora helped plan it with the same competent energy she brought to everything. And Elias, who had not been to a social event in over 2 years, attended and stood at the edge of the gathering for approximately 8 minutes before finding himself in a conversation about cattle breeding with 3 other ranchers that lasted the rest of the evening. And Nora watched him across the room, being the man Isabel had described, the one with opinions and easy laughter, and thought that the best work she had done in her life was not the cooking or the cleaning or the household accounts. It was simply being present until he was ready to be present again. Clarence played his fiddle, and at some point in the evening Elias found her and held out his hand, and she took it, and they danced in the open-air space outside the schoolhouse in the warm summer night, awkwardly at first because neither of them was particularly skilled, and then with the easy confidence of 2 people who don't mind being imperfect at something as long as they're imperfect together. "I had forgotten I can dance," he said, which was generous given the evidence. "You are being kind to yourself," she said. "I'm being optimistic," he said, and spun her, which worked out better than expected, and she laughed with her head back, and he held on to her hands, and something in the night air around them was exactly right. By the time Samuel was 6 months old, he was the most universally beloved person on the Calhoun property. Pete, who had been somewhat reserved about infants in the abstract, was completely won over by September, and could be found on slow afternoons holding Samuel on the porch, with the practiced ease of a man who turns out to have a natural gift for it. Jacob read to him from Washington Irving, having expanded his reading considerably, and deciding that the best use of an attentive infant was a captive audience. Thomas carried him around the yard showing him things, horses, birds, the shape of the hills, with the proprietary pride of a brother who had asked for this, and received it and was not taking it for granted. Elias was magnificent with him. That was the simple truth of it. He had always been a good father to Jacob and Thomas, but the tenderness of the man who had come back from the worst year of his life to hold a new child was something entirely its own. He held Samuel in the evenings on the porch and talked to him about the land, about the pastures and the creek and the 40 new acres on the south boundary, about the fence line and the cattle and the work of the place, in the tone of a man introducing someone important to everything he loves. Nora would sit nearby in the evenings, with her journal or her mending or simply nothing, and listen to him talk to the baby about the ranch, and she would understand with a completeness that was beyond doubt that she was, in the fullest possible sense, home. One evening in the autumn of 1880, exactly 2 years after she had first driven down the path past the sign on the gate post, Elias came and sat beside her on the porch in the rocking chairs that had become their evening territory and said, "I want to take the sign down." She looked at him. "The gate post sign?" "Yes," he said. "It's been there 2 years. It should come down." "You could have taken it down any time," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to be sure." "And now you're sure," she said. "I am entirely sure," he said, in the voice that carried everything without excess. He got up and walked down the path in the evening light, and she watched him pull the sign from the gate post and roll it in his hands, and then set it aside against the fence. And he stood at the open gate for a moment looking back at the house, at the lighted windows and the window boxes and the porch where she sat. And she lifted her hand and he lifted his. And that was enough. He came back up the path and sat down beside her and picked up his coffee, and they looked at the land together in the October evening. "No solicitors," she said. "No," he said. "No preachers. No matchmakers." He looked at her with those walnut-dark eyes full of warmth that was entirely his and entirely for her. "No matchmakers," he agreed. "I did not need one." "You did not," she said. "I only needed one very determined woman to drive through a gate she had no business driving through," he said. "On a Tuesday," she said. "On a Tuesday," he agreed, and she leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and the October evening settled softly around the Calhoun Ranch. 340 acres of Texas hill country that felt like everything it should, and the gate stood open in the last of the light, and the sign lay flat against the fence, and it was done. The years after that arranged themselves with the particular grace of a life that has found its proper shape. Elias Calhoun did not become a different man. He remained himself stubborn when the situation called for it, which was not infrequently deliberate, direct, quietly funny when the occasion warranted, and entirely serious about the things that deserved seriousness. But the version of himself that lived in the years after Nora was more wholly present than the version that had nailed signs to gate posts and refused the world entry. Nora did not become a different woman. She remained exactly herself, practical, warm, fiercely capable, direct in the best possible way, tending to everything within her reach with the same thorough care she had given the window boxes in September of 1878. She learned the land the way she had learned everything in her life, with patient observation and genuine love for the subject. And over time, she knew the Calhoun Ranch as well as any person who had been born on it. Samuel grew into a boy who had his father's jaw and his mother's green eyes and Thomas's absolute certainty about everything, which was either going to make him a natural leader or a considerable difficulty, and probably both. Jacob left for San Antonio at 14, as they had planned, for formal schooling, and wrote home every week with letters that grew longer and more elaborate as his education expanded, and came home for summers and holidays and brought books for Thomas, who had discovered history, and honey candy for Samuel, who had discovered confections, and sat with his father in the evenings and talked about what he was learning with the same kind of direct, engaged honesty that was the Calhoun family's characteristic mode. Thomas stayed. Of course Thomas stayed. He had decided at 9 that the land was his vocation, and he had been right about that. By the time he was 16, he was working the ranch with Elias and Pete as a full third hand, and there was a quality in him at work that was both his father's seriousness and something entirely his own, an ease with the land and the animals that went beyond learned skill into genuine instinct. Pete Alvarez stayed too, growing older in the way that men who spend their lives outdoors grow older, which is slowly and then suddenly, the lines on his face deepening and his movement becoming more deliberate and the silver in his mustache becoming more silver. He was family. He had always been family, and it was acknowledged now rather than implied. Nora planted more things in the window boxes and in a proper kitchen garden on the south side of the house where the light was good, and the ranch house that had felt like nothing for over a year became, gradually and permanently, one of the most alive houses in that part of the hill country. People who came for supper said so. Isabel Hooper said so. Even Gerald Prout at the post office said so, though he had never actually been invited to supper. He had simply observed the general quality of the mail the household sent and received, which he considered diagnostic. On an October evening in 1883, 5 years after Nora had driven a wagon through a gate with a sign she had no intention of obeying, Elias and Nora sat on the porch together, as they did every evening the weather allowed, And the stars were coming out over the hill country in the big extravagant way they came out in October. And inside the house Jacob's most recent letter was on the kitchen table, full of news about his studies and his life in San Antonio. And Thomas and Samuel were in the barn finishing up the evening chores with Pete, and the ranch was quiet in the particular full-bodied way of a place that has everything it needs. Elias said, "Do you remember what you said to me on the first day?" "I said a great many things on the first day," she said. "I was making up for lost time." "You said small towns still need things done," he said. She smiled. "I did say that." "You had just found out the position you came for didn't exist," he said. "You had $32 and 3 days of travel behind you and nowhere to go." "I had somewhere to go," she said. "I just hadn't gotten there yet." He looked at her with the look that had been there since before he had admitted it even to himself, the one she had first properly seen on a rainy November afternoon in a parlor with a poetry book between them. "Here," he said. "Here," she agreed. He reached over and took her hand, which he had been doing for 5 years and which still meant the same thing it had always meant, which was everything. The stars came out over the Calhoun Ranch, 340 acres of Texas hill country growing and alive, and the gate at the end of the path stood open as it had stood since October of 1880, and there was no sign on the post. There was no need for a sign. There had not been since the Tuesday a woman with auburn hair and green eyes and $32 had decided that a sign was not the kind of thing that applied to her. It had not applied to her. And everything that followed from that had been exactly, completely, and irrevocably right.